With just one page, the black president of a small West African nation stopped a $5 billion deal from China. His name was Ibrahim Traoré. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten. He simply read something no one else bothered to check. Page 168. What he found wasn't just a legal clause, it was a trap, a takeover. Hidden behind polite language, corporate smiles, and promises of prosperity was a mechanism to seize his country's oil minerals and sovereignty without firing a single bullet. He was expected to sign, to smile, to obey, but instead, he stood up and walked away. And what followed wasn't just a political twist, it was a spark. One that would light fires across a continent long told it must choose between poverty and submission. This story is a dramatized narrative inspired by real global dynamics, but the characters, events, and dialogues are fictionalized. Still, the emotions, the fears, the dignity it speaks to are deeply real. Because sometimes the line between truth and fiction is written in fine print. Like on page 168, the chandeliers in the presidential hall of Ouagadougou had never glowed this brightly. Crystal beams hung like frozen waterfalls from the ceiling, casting soft halos of gold across polished marble floors. Rows of dignitaries, foreign investors, military leaders, and journalists from around the globe packed the long mahogany tables arranged in a ceremonial U. The flags of Burkina Faso and China fluttered side by side behind the stage, their colors stitched with diplomatic precision. Cameras rolled, reporters whispered, tablets tapped. Every screen in the room was trained on one man, President Ibrahim Traoré. He stood tall at the head of the room, not in military uniform, but in a finely woven Faso Dan Fani tunic, the traditional cloth of the Burkinabe people. Simple, dignified. His eyes, however, were anything but soft. Sharp, calm, unwavering. He didn't speak yet. He simply scanned the room, and the room, sensing something, held its breath. At the other end of the table sat Shen Bao, the CEO of Zhongshan Rare Earth Mining Group, dressed in a tailored black suit that shimmered subtly under the lights. His face wore the kind of smile you'd expect to see on a man who had already won, not arrogant, but deeply assured. His posture was impeccable. His fingers folded neatly over the pen placed before him, a pen that cost more than some families in this country earned in a year. A government aide leaned in to whisper something in Shen's ear. He nodded slightly, never breaking eye contact with the cameras. The announcer's voice boomed through the chamber. Today marks a new era of prosperity between the People's Republic of China and the proud nation of Burkina Faso. A historic $5 billion partnership for the extraction and development of rare earth elements vital to global technology and to regional growth. Polite applause, polished handshakes, a prepared photo op flashed, but Traoré hadn't moved. His chair remained slightly back from the table. His hands rested on the thick printed document in front of him, a 218-page contract bound in red leather, embossed with 2 gold seals. His index finger tapped lightly on a dog-eared corner. Cameras zoomed in. Viewers watching across the continent noticed the president wasn't smiling. A journalist from Le Faso whispered into his mic, "Something's wrong. He's not signing." The tension rose, subtle but real. Traoré leaned forward, not toward the pen, but toward the papers. His hand flipped to a page near the end. Page 168. His eyes narrowed. His lips pressed into a faint line. The room stilled again. It was as if a single page in a sea of legal jargon had just shifted the weight of history. Shen Bao shifted in his seat. His smile faltered only slightly, but Traoré saw it. He glanced left toward Aminata, his trusted advisor and chief translator, who stood just behind him. She caught his glance and almost imperceptibly gave a short nod. He returned to the page. To the outside world, this was meant to be a done deal. A celebration, months of negotiation, dozens of meetings, drafts reviewed, interpreters dispatched, flags printed, dinners hosted. The Chinese had called it a model of cooperation, but Traoré had not come here for celebration. He had come for confirmation of a suspicion that had been whispering to him like dust in the corners of the palace halls. What he had just seen on page 168 wasn't just a clause, it was something else. It didn't belong. It didn't match the language in the French version. and it certainly didn't match the promises his people were told. He looked up. "Mr. Shen," he said softly. Shen Bao straightened, poised for praise. "Before I sign," Traoré continued, "could you explain something?" Shen nodded, courteous. "Of course, Mr. President." Traoré flipped the contract around, tapped a line with his finger. "Why does this clause grant your company security and operational jurisdiction over oil fields? Up to 60 kilometers outside the designated mining zones." Silence. Like a switch thrown in the spine of the room, everything stopped. No one clapped, no one moved. No camera dared blink. Shen's smile froze. He opened his mouth and then closed it again. The translator leaned in, whispering furiously. Traoré didn't wait. He stood, calm, steady, unmistakably clear. And in that moment, something shifted, not just in the room, but in the country, and maybe in the continent. Because if one man could stop a $5 billion machine with a single question, what else was buried in the pages no one ever read? Traoré's finger hovered over the page like it sensed something before his eyes could. It was a subtle instinct, one that had saved him in battlefields long before it had saved him in boardrooms. He had read this contract before several times, but this moment felt different, final. He turned to the last section, page 168, the corner already dog-eared. His eyes scanned the paragraph in the middle slowly at first, then again faster. Then again, but this time, slower. There it was. Clause 8.4, Yongxiang Mining Group shall retain autonomous security and operational jurisdiction within a 60-kilometer radius of designated mining zones, including but not limited to access to surrounding hydrocarbons, energy reserves, and regional infrastructure as deemed necessary for project sustainability. He blinked once, then twice. The room filled with chatter only moments ago now felt off. The air hung thicker. The clinking of glasses, the idle camera flashes, the hushed whispers, all of it dimmed under a silent weight that no one else seemed to feel yet. Traoré sat back slightly, the contract still open in front of him. He didn't look at Shen Bao immediately. He looked up at the massive chandeliers above, watching them sway slightly, like a slow, silent pendulum, marking the seconds before something would fall. Then finally he asked calmly, but loud enough for everyone to hear, "Why does this clause give you control over our oil too?" At first, no one reacted. It was as if the words hadn't registered. But when they did, it was like a glitch in a machine. Someone dropped a pen. A translator froze mid-sentence. Camera shutters that had been clicking non-stop suddenly stopped. Shen Bao's smile didn't vanish, but it stiffened just enough for those watching closely to notice. He leaned forward, finger-steepled voice, smooth as ever. "Mr. President, I believe what you're referring to is a standard protective clause regarding logistical infrastructure, hydrocarbons." Traoré interrupted, eyes still locked on Shen's. "That's our oil. And operational jurisdiction is not logistics, it's governance." Shen Bao offered a polite chuckle. "There may have been a misinterpretation in the translation." "No," said a soft voice behind Traoré. It was Aminata stepping forward. "The Mandarin version says Zizhu Guanzhichu, autonomous jurisdiction, not temporary access, not logistical oversight, jurisdiction." There was a pause, a long one. Traoré turned the document so others could see the paragraph. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "If this clause is standard," he said then, "why wasn't it in the French version I signed off on last month?" No one answered. Shen's face remained composed, but his hand tapped twice quickly against the table. An aide in a black suit leaned in, whispering rapidly in Mandarin. A flicker of tension flashed across Shen's jawline. But Traoré had already seen it. He looked around the room. All eyes were on him now. But they weren't just watching, they were waiting. Not for a signature, for a decision. Aminata didn't raise her voice, but her words cut clean through the tension like a hidden blade. "We warned them." Traoré glanced sideways. Her expression was unreadable, yet her voice carried an old weight, not panic, but inevitability. Like someone watching a tree fall they had seen crack months ago. She didn't explain further, but he knew what she meant. It wasn't the first time something had felt off, and suddenly it all came rushing back. 3 weeks earlier, a private dinner at the Grand Meridian Hotel. The Chinese delegation had invited top ministers' advisors, and select business elites from Burkina Faso. The room had smelled of cedarwood diplomacy and quiet ambition. Shen Bao had been in high spirits, sipping a glass of imported baijiu, fielding questions, with the poise of a man who had already memorized the outcome. At one point, while raising his glass in a toast, he had turned to TRAORÉ and said almost playfully, but not without weight, "Legacy minerals are forever. They outlive kings, presidents, even nations. And those who understand that will always stay in power." A few guests chuckled, assuming it was some poetic idiom from the East. But Aminata didn't laugh. She had tilted her head slightly, her eyes sharpening. Later that night in the car ride back to the presidential quarters, she had leaned in and whispered to TRAORÉ. He didn't say access to minerals. He said inheritance. The Mandarin term he used was Yichan Zi Wen, legacy resources. That doesn't mean lease or license. It means transfer of ownership. TRAORÉ had paused, then nodded silently. At the time, it felt like a linguistic quirk. Now, standing here with page 168 open and the clause laid bare, it felt like a warning shot they had all ignored. The ceremony ended in confusion. Officials whispered, journalists speculated. Shen Bao kept a tight smile, but the gleam in his eye had dulled. The press release was delayed, and the cameras no longer chased a handshake, but a question. Had the president just walked away from $5 billion, by the time the sun dipped beneath the horizon, the presidential convoy was already en route back to Kushum Palace. The halls of the compound felt colder than usual, empty despite the guards, heavy despite the silence. TRAORÉ entered his private study, removed his jacket, and sat down beneath the portrait of Thomas Sankara. The light was dim. On the table in front of him, a cup of tea, his annotated copy of the contract, and a leather-bound journal filled with notes from months of negotiation. He opened it to a flagged page and circled a line in red. They don't need troops, just paper. Paper with the right words. Aminata entered quietly, placing a folder on his desk, comparison translations. Security reports a new memo from intelligence. Her eyes met his. "It's not just about the mine, is it?" she asked. He shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "It never was." Outside, the night deepened. No explosions, no marching boots, no gunfire. But make no mistake, the war had begun. And this one would be fought not with rifles, but with ink. The palace lights burned late into the night. By 2:13 a.m., most staff had gone home or fallen asleep at their desks. But in the Situation Room, two people were wide awake. President Ibrahim Traoré's sleeves rolled, eyes narrowed, and Aminata, flanked by two linguists and a legal advisor, flipping through document after document with military precision. On the long oak table lay two copies of the same agreement, or so it was supposed to be. One in French, the official working language of Burkina Faso, the other in Mandarin, stamped and sealed by Yongshang's legal department. Side by side, line by line, they combed through every section, and the deeper they went, the darker it became. "Here," Aminata muttered, pointing. Article 11.2. In the French version, the clause read plainly, "The company shall operate within the legal framework established by the Burkinabe government under time-limited access." In Mandarin, the phrasing was slightly more elaborate and sinister. It says, "Gai Qi Ye Jiangshang Yuguansha Quen," she read aloud, "shall enjoy jurisdiction, not access, not cooperation, jurisdiction." Traoré's brow furrowed. "That's not a translation error," he said. Aminata nodded. "It's a legal switch, a calibrated misalignment, subtle but deliberate." And then came the bombshell. Aminata, flipping to the appendix index, paused. The French copy ends at appendix 4b. The Mandarin version has a 4c. Everyone looked up. She tapped her screen. Appendix 4c is titled Contingency Protocols for Multinational Security Deployment in Mineral Corridors. There's no mention of it in our version, not a line. Inside Appendix 4c were 22 pages of security infrastructure coordination guidelines. Language that sounded routine, even boring, until you noticed what it really meant. The right to build independent checkpoints, control local transit zones, deploy foreign-trained private forces, and bypass Burkinabe chain of command in times of operational threat as defined solely by the investing party. So they could declare a threat, Traoré said slowly, and activate their own military force on our soil without asking us. Aminata didn't answer. She didn't need to. Traoré leaned back, staring up at the ceiling, as if trying to trace the shadow of how deep this went. His country had nearly handed over legal control of its most resource-rich region with the stroke of a pen, and no one would have noticed. Not the press, not the courts, not even him, unless they spoke Mandarin. He stood suddenly, walked across the room, and pulled out a cabinet drawer labeled Archived Negotiation Drafts. He flipped through the documents himself, rough early versions, proposal copies from month 1, and the original agreement sent from Yongshang's team. Page by page, he began checking. Version 1, Appendix 4C, didn't exist. Version 2, Clause 8.4, said temporary access. Version 3, the language began to shift. Operational control in urgent zones. By version 5, it had become autonomous security jurisdiction. And yet, every French version stopped short of the real text. Backdoor clauses, hidden in translation. The final nail came when he found a version of the contract labeled Working Copy for Legal Alignment. In the margin of Appendix 4C, someone likely from the Chinese side had written in Mandarin, "Ensure clause is not mirrored in French version until post-signature phase." His throat tightened. The deal had been structured like a Trojan horse, a friendly contract carrying inside it a quiet invasion, wrapped in legalese and sealed with trust. He looked over at Aminata. Her face was pale with quiet fury. "How many others have signed things like this?" she asked. Traoré didn't respond, but his silence said everything. This wasn't just a bad deal. It was a test, and they almost failed it. By dawn, the situation had shifted from suspicion to strategy. What began as a legal anomaly now demanded something far more uncomfortable: an investigation into Traoré's own cabinet. The morning briefing was tense. Aminata arrived with a folder marked Internal Influence Review Phase 1. No one else spoke as she laid out the findings, her voice calm, but each word a blade. These are the men who pushed hardest for immediate approval of the Zhongxiang deal. Not just in meetings, behind closed doors. They pressured lower-level analysts to skip translations. They cut legal review windows by more than 40%. They bypassed Ministry of Justice checkpoints and inserted final clauses without logging protocol. She placed 2 names on the table: Minister Kabor Natural Resources, Minister Ouattara Energy and Infrastructure. Traoré stared at the names for a long time. Both men had been with him since the beginning. Revolution days, exile days, the kind who took photos in the mines with their sleeves rolled up and posted slogans about sovereignty on state media. But it wasn't what they said that mattered now. It was what they hid. Aminata flipped open a document labeled Transaction Chain, February to May. It detailed a series of bank transfers routed through 3 shell companies in the Seychelles, leading to a consulting firm in Accra, Ghana. That firm had purchased 2 beachfront properties, both within 6 months of the deal entering final negotiation. One was under the name Cab Holdings, the other Utech Energy Limited, owned by a Ghanaian lawyer whose only listed client was Ouattara's cousin. It was elegant, quiet, textbook compromise. Traoré ran a hand over his face. His expression was less anger than something colder, betrayal layered with resignation. These men hadn't simply taken bribes. They had greased the wheels for foreign control while pretending to wave the flag of independence. And they hadn't just done it for themselves. They'd done it under his watch. He rose from his seat, walked slowly to the window, and looked out over the capital. Ouagadougou glowed faintly in the early morning haze, its rooftops gold under a reluctant sun. People were waking, shops opening, children walking to school, unaware that just a few signatures could have shifted the future beneath their feet. He spoke softly, almost to himself. "They didn't just sell us out. They sold our children." Aminata didn't reply. She knew better than to interrupt the silence that followed a line like that. Traoré turned back to the table, straighter now, stronger. "I want a full forensic audit on every minister involved. No warning, no favoritism. Start with Kabor and Ouattara, then go deeper. I want every document, every message, every meeting logged." He paused, then added quietly, "No media, not yet, because this war wasn't only being fought with ink anymore. Now it was also being fought with shadows." It began with a simple report from General Zongo, head of National Defense. A routine security audit, he called it. Nothing urgent until he handed over the satellite images. Traoré sat at the edge of the briefing table, sleeves rolled, jaw clenched. Aminata stood behind him, flipping through the printed stills, each one labeled, dated, geotagged, each one showing the same quiet anomaly infrastructure crews working near high-value strategic zones. They wore civilian uniforms labeled as engineering contractors under Zhongshan Group. But Zongo's team had noticed the way they moved in formations, not construction clusters. They carried communication gear with encryption frequencies used by military contractors. Some even had drone units hovering just beyond public perimeters. There were thermal footprints suggesting underground work less than 200 meters from military storage depots. Zongo spoke carefully measured like a soldier reporting a hidden ambush. They don't carry rifles, but they move like operators. We intercepted drone signals mapping corridors through the southeast. They were never after the minerals alone. Traoré leaned forward, eyes scanning the map laid across the table. The infamous 60-kilometer operational zones from Appendix 4C had been marked in red. At first glance, they appeared to wrap around mining sites. But then something emerged, a pattern subtle but undeniable. He drew a circle around each 60-kilometer radius. One by one, they overlapped critical infrastructure, the Northern Gas Pipeline, the Sika Hydroelectric Dam, 3 telecom relay towers, and 2 National Army bases. Zongo stepped in again, pointing to the southern border. Here, he said, they positioned a survey unit within 3 kilometers of our encrypted fiber optic relay. No construction plan filed, no coordination with local authorities, just showed up, set up camp, began scanning. A chill ran down Traoré's spine. This wasn't logistics. This wasn't mining. This was mapping. He stepped back, eyes tracing the red zones, not like a president reading a map, but like a soldier analyzing a battlefield. Every circle was a net, and inside each net was a nexus of power, energy, water, military data. Not one of them was random. He looked up slowly, voice low, words deliberate. They were not mining. He paused, hand resting on the map, fingers pressing into the red ink. They were mapping power. Silence followed. Not the silence of confusion, but of recognition. Aminata's breath caught. Zongo stiffened. It wasn't just betrayal now. It was preparation. These weren't just backdoor clauses in contracts, they were backdoor operations in reality. And if Traoré had signed that document, those zones would have become legal jurisdictions of a foreign entity immune to Burkina command. No need for an invasion, just access. No need to fire a single shot, just survey, secure, and wait. He closed the map slowly and looked up at his team, no longer just ministers, advisors, or aides. Now they were part of something else. From this moment, he said, voice level, we treat this not as a trade negotiation, but as a silent occupation. And now the ink had dried. The war was not approaching. It had already begun. The Grand Hall in Addis Ababa shimmered with diplomatic theater. 30 nations had gathered for the Pan-African Infrastructure Investment Summit. Flags lined the vaulted ceiling like a curtain of nations. Classical music from a West African orchestra filled the air, dramatic, hopeful, rehearsed to perfection. At the far end of the hall, cameras from CGTN, Xinhua, BBC, Al Jazeera, and France 24 were lined shoulder to shoulder, their lenses glinting like judgmental eyes waiting to broadcast history. The room pulsed with choreographed optimism, suits pressed to perfection, smiles sharpened for headlines, banners that read, "Prosperity through Partnership." In smaller print beneath a golden skyline, Africa-China Infrastructure Future. Amid it all, seated at the central table beneath the summit's towering logo, was President Ibrahim Traoré. His chair was not elevated, but it might as well have been. He sat composed, hands clasped, eyes steady. The air around him was still like the pause before the blade drops in a duel. Across the table sat Shen Bao, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit, his tie the color of ink. His smile was relaxed, confident, rehearsed for victory. To either side of him sat Chinese trade envoys and private executives. They were calm. They had every reason to be. Between them on the table, flat, smooth, and silent, lay the contract. Leather-bound, embossed with 2 seals, identical to the one from Ouagadougou. In front of Traoré was a ceremonial pen. Next to it, a small tab marked the critical section, page 168. A crimson ribbon bookmark had been inserted as if mocking the very idea of subtlety. He didn't pick up the pen. He tapped the edge of the contract with one finger. Slowly, rhythmically. 4 taps. Shen leaned in, slightly lowering his voice, just enough to sound intimate, but not enough to lose the microphone feed. "It's the same agreement, Mr. President," he said, smiling. "As promised, we've even printed it in your national colors. Burkina Faso will be the new frontier, the center of innovation." Traoré looked at him without blinking. "Yes," he replied, "but who's building the fence?" There was a pause, not long, but sharp. A few rows back, Aminata stood quietly among Burkina's delegation. Her eyes were on her president, her hands folded, expression unreadable. She knew the entire world was watching. And so did he. One misstep, one hesitation, one ambiguous expression, and the story would be written without him. The signing table wasn't just a desk, now it was a stage, a trap, and a crossroads all at once. And then for a brief moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The music faded into silence. The cameras leaned forward without moving. An entire room, and possibly a continent, waited to see if a single man would pick up a pen and surrender a future or defy the momentum of billions. He reached for the page, not the pen, and opened to 168. Read it again, then again, as if he expected the words to change under pressure. They hadn't. He looked up. Shen's smile remained, but there was now a flicker behind it, a tick barely visible in the corner of his jaw. He hadn't expected a scene. Not here, not now. Traoré tapped the pen once against the table, then laid it flat. "If this deal was so fair," he said quietly, "why did you hide the part about our oil? Our bases, our children?" It wasn't a question, it was a judgment. A ripple moved through the room, a sudden shift of posture, the sound of cameras reactivating. Whispers cut the air like glass. One journalist mouthed, "Is he refusing again?" Another whispered back, "He's not refusing, he's confronting." And for the first time that day, Shenbao didn't smile. Traoré closed the contract, folded his hands over it, and looked calmly into the nearest camera lens. He didn't need to shout. He just needed the world to watch. The room remained breathless as Traoré slid the contract toward him once more. No fanfare, no commentary. He flipped directly to page 168, fingers, steady voice composed. Then lifting the microphone slightly closer, he began to read aloud. Article 8.4.2, he said, his voice quiet but amplified through the summit hall. "The investing party shall retain autonomous jurisdiction within a 60-kilometer operational radius with full security discretion and infrastructural governance, auto-renewable every 5 years, under conditions deemed emergent by the investing party." There was a pause, long enough for the words to settle, long enough for diplomats in row 4 to glance at each other, long enough for cameras to start zooming in. A sharp gasp escaped from someone in the EU delegation. A translator repeated the clause in French with growing unease. Another in Swahili. The Mandarin interpreter hesitated, then stopped altogether. Shenbao didn't smile this time. He cleared his throat, leaned in, and raised a hand. "President Traoré," he said calmly, "these clauses are precautionary. Emergency planning is standard language in all long-term multinational agreements. It ensures stability." No, Traoré cut in voice low but steel hard. "It ensures control, not stability. Control." Shen pressed on, faltering slightly. "Mr. President, the term autonomous jurisdiction refers only to operational efficiency, not sovereign authority." "Then why does it override local law?" Traoré snapped. Silence. Shen opened his mouth but found nothing useful to say. Traoré stood slowly, taking the microphone into his hand. No podium, no teleprompter, just him, alone at the center of a storm he had chosen not to run from. "This isn't a contract," he said, scanning the room, letting his gaze land on each face, each diplomat, each blinking red camera light. "This is conquest, wearing a suit." A hush fell so fast it felt like the walls had swallowed sound. In the back row, a Chinese delegate reached for his earpiece, panicked. A Western ambassador froze mid-sip. A dozen journalists pressed record. Autonomous zones, Traoré continued, walking slowly around the table. Military support units disguised as engineers. Infrastructure corridors that just happened to sit over our oil pipelines. Our army bases, our water. All of it embedded in legalese, so thick you need a linguist and a lawyer just to realize your country's being sold off, clause by clause. The cameras were no longer just watching, they were locked, tracking his every move, streaming his every word. You call it investment, he said, pausing by the French delegation. But we know what this is. We've seen it before. In gold, in cocoa, in rubber. You changed the uniforms. You updated the language. But the empire still wants what it always wanted: our resources, without our people. No one dared interrupt. Not anymore. He turned to Shen Bao one last time. You didn't come to partner, he said. You came to plant a flag, and you thought we wouldn't notice. Then, without waiting for permission or applause, Traoré dropped the mic, not with a bang, but a soft final thud against the mahogany desk. He turned and walked off stage. No ceremony, no signature. And as he moved, the room, so carefully staged for celebration, began to crack. Officials stood too quickly. Delegates whispered furiously. Chinese media scrambled to cut feeds. Western journalists pushed forward. The summit's orchestra, unsure whether to play or remain silent, simply froze. What was meant to be the largest signing of the decade had just imploded. And at the center of it stood one man, unshaken, unbought, and very much unafraid. By the time the presidential jet touched down in Ouagadougou, the world had already changed. Not with gunfire, not with headlines, but with a hashtag. Hashtag page 168. It appeared first on a small Burkinabe news blog posted by a young freelance journalist still in the media pit at the summit. He didn't sign the deal. He signed the start of a new era. Within hours, the quote had gone viral. Across West Africa, it flooded timelines. In Lagos, in Dakar, in Bamako, users reshared clips of Traoré's calm defiance, his line-by-line exposure of the hidden clause the moment he dropped the mic and walked away without looking back. Teenagers posted reactions with music overlays. Political activists re-edited footage with subtitles in slow motion. By midnight, it had crossed oceans. Al Jazeera, Reuters, South China, Morning Post, CNN in Africa. They all ran variations of the same headline: Burkina Faso president rejects 5B deal over secret sovereignty clause. But what happened inside the country was something no one predicted. There were no riots, no clashes, no fires. There was celebration. Spontaneous marches erupted in mining towns, first the very places the deal would have affected most. In Yako, workers left the gold pits and walked into the main road, arms linked, chanting, "Our soil, our rules. No clause without us." In the capital, students from the university streamed out into the streets. With painted signs, read the contract. Burkina is not for sale. Page 168 woke us up. There were drums, singing, dancing. Entire neighborhoods turned into open-air rallies, not of defiance but of dignity reclaimed. Inside the presidential palace, the celebration felt heavier, not louder, but real. Traoré stood by the Situation Room monitors, watching the live feed stream in. His hands were clasped behind his back. He didn't smile, but there was something in his eyes, a stillness made of pride and exhaustion. Aminata entered quietly, a tablet in her hand. "We have confirmation," she said. "The bribe trails are solid. Shell accounts linked directly to both ministers. Villas, stock purchases, unreported income." He turned to her, his voice low. "Then we act. Today. Publicly." Before dusk it was done. Minister Kabor and Minister Ouattara were arrested outside their private compounds, escorted by National Guards. No media embargo, no delay. State television broadcast the footage with a single caption: "Burkina Faso does not negotiate its dignity." That evening, during the golden hour, a single photograph went viral across Francophone Africa. It showed Traoré standing on the palace steps alone in traditional Faso Denfani as a crowd gathered behind the gates chanting his name. He wasn't waving. He wasn't posing. He was simply there, real, grounded, unshaken. The young journalist who'd first posted the quote captioned the photo again. He didn't sign the deal. He signed the start of a new era. And we signed it with him. It started with silence. No headlines. No press releases. No angry ambassadors. Just silence. Within 48 hours of the Addis Ababa summit, Chinese-funded projects across Burkina Faso went dark. Construction sites, once filled with humming machines and workers in yellow helmets, stood abandoned. Roads stopped mid-pour. Bridges half raised now stretched like broken ribs across dried-out riverbeds. In the Northeast, a new maternal clinic once hailed as a flagship cooperation effort was shuttered overnight. Power was cut. Supplies disappeared. Staff were given indefinite leave. Women arrived the next morning in labor, only to find locked gates and dust. In Hyundai, residents woke to find an entire grain storage facility burned to the ground. Officials called it a short circuit. Locals knew better. They remembered the protest held there 2 days earlier, where farmers chanted, "Not for sale." Then came the blackouts. 5 provinces, no electricity, no warnings. Transformer stations malfunctioned within hours of each other, despite being on separate grids. State technicians couldn't access repair zones. The gates had been locked from the inside by contractors who had vanished. The outages lasted for days. Businesses shuttered, food spoiled. Phone networks blinked off one by one. Rumors filled the void. Chinese engineers had planted kill switches. The blackout was punishment, a warning. By day, 4 people stopped whispering, because the pattern was clear. This wasn't coincidence. It was retaliation. Inside Koshiam Palace, the Situation Room buzzed with crisis reports. Every hour brought a new red folder: transport halted, dam sensors offline, internet bottlenecks, missing satellite connections. The infrastructure they had allowed foreign contractors to build: hospitals, telecoms, water stations, had turned against them. Quietly, completely. General Zongo leaned over the operations table, his voice tight. "This is asymmetrical warfare," he said. "No soldiers, no drones, just pressure, systemic, economic, psychological." President Traoré stood at the center of it, all eyes fixed on the map, now glowing with outage zones overlapping, strangely, with the same 60-kilometer operational areas from the contract, the same ones they had marked weeks ago and thought diffused. They were not diffused. They were waiting. "They knew we'd say no," Aminata said quietly. "They planned for it." Traoré didn't respond immediately. His face was carved in thought. Then he spoke slowly, more to himself than the room. "It's not about what we refused. It's about what we revealed. If we expose the clause, others might look into theirs." She nodded grimly. "They're not trying to punish us. They're trying to make us a warning." Outside the palace, fear began to creep in. People lined up at fuel stations worried about supply cuts. Farmers demanded guards for their storage houses. Traders started hoarding goods. For the first time in weeks, hope gave way to anxiety. But not everyone broke. In the streets of Bobo Dioulasso, children painted murals of Traoré, blocking a giant pen from stabbing into a map of Africa. On campus in Ouaga, students held night lectures by candlelight titled "Post-Colonial Contracts and Invisible War." One phrase began to echo through the resistance movement, a whisper at first, then a rallying cry. They own the lights, but not the fire. They tried to turn out the lights. But in the darkness, something unexpected began to glow. It started on a university campus, dusty, quiet, half-powered. With the grid still offline and classes suspended indefinitely, a group of engineering students from Ouagadougou Polytechnic broke into their old workshop. They scavenged old panels, rewired burnt-out inverters, soldered parts from broken lanterns. Within days, they had built 5 DIY solar kits, enough to power emergency radios, community fridges, and small lighting grids in dormitories. They called it Project Moaga, after the ancestral word for the person of dignity. They posted their diagrams online along with a handwritten message. "We are not waiting for the lights to come back. We are building our own sun." The post went viral. By the end of the week, dozens of neighborhoods across the capital had versions of the Moaga kits running on rooftops, schoolyards, even old market stalls. What began as desperation transformed into a culture of creation. In the rural South, where grain silos had been sabotaged, farmers gathered not to complain, but to organize. Smallholder collectives merged into cooperative food councils, no longer competing for state subsidies, but pooling resources. They planted rotating fields, guarded shared seed banks, built mud brick storage units with community patrols. What they couldn't buy, they bartered. One elder farmer, interviewed by a journalist from Côte d'Ivoire, said simply, "If they burn our silos, we build underground. If they block our trucks, we walk. We've survived worse, and now we're not alone." But it was the women who moved first when the bridges failed. In the suburbs of Koudougou and Gawa, Local women's associations, once focused on literacy and maternal health, formed infrastructure repair brigades. They cleared storm drains, patched school walls, swept ash from burned-out clinics, and charted collapsed road points with chalk so others wouldn't fall. Some wore reflective vests, most didn't. They simply worked methodically, relentlessly. When asked why they were risking injury to repair what was government responsibility, one mother of four replied, "Government. We are the government now. In a country that was supposed to be left panicked and broken, the opposite had begun. People weren't just surviving. They were organizing, rebuilding not just what was lost, but what had never truly been theirs, ownership of the future." And then one morning, on a crumbling wall across from the burned-out International Development Office in downtown Wagga, a mural appeared, painted by unknown hands, rough, bright, full of life. It showed three figures, a child, a mother, and a student, all holding shovels. Behind them, the sun rose over a field of solar panels, rows of grain, and a single unbroken radio antenna. Across the bottom, scrawled in bold red, "We dig our future, and we defend it." The image spread like wildfire. Within hours, prints of the mural appeared in shop windows, hospital waiting rooms, taxi dashboards, even military barracks. They had tried to dim the country's light. Instead, they had lit a fire. Aminata found the recordings buried deep in a hard drive labeled security briefs, drafts only. At first, the folder seemed routine encrypted briefings, surveillance logs, half-finished memos, but then a subfolder, Private Exchange Room 4. No metadata, no tags, just 3 voice files, each less than 2 minutes long. She played the first one alone. The voices were unmistakable. "We'll manufacture instability, blackouts, food pressure, a little chaos, enough to make them beg for order again. Their ministers are already ours." A second voice laughed, sharp, low, unhurried. "They think one speech changes the world. Let's remind them who holds the ink." Aminata sat still for a long time after that. Then she copied the files to a secure drive, sealed the laptop, and walked directly to President Traoré's office. By the next morning, the tapes had been authenticated and submitted to the National Tribunal. The hearings were not held behind closed doors. On the contrary, they were public televised and streamed live. The court was set in the old Parliament chamber, now turned into a temporary tribunal hall. The walls still bore bullet marks from a past coup. This time, the revolution came with evidence. Minister Kabor, pale and drawn, took the stand on day 3. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. When asked about the payments routed through shell companies, he didn't deny them. When asked about the classified meetings with foreign advisors, he didn't flinch. But when the judge asked him why, he hesitated, then answered, voice cracking, "I didn't believe we could do it alone. I thought we needed them. Their roads, their money, their maps." There was silence, not of shock, but of quiet recognition. A man caught not just in crime, but in doubt. Traoré watched from the gallery. He didn't gloat. He didn't lean forward. When the presiding magistrate asked if the president wished to speak before sentencing began, he stood not to accuse, but to define. He walked slowly to the center of the room, placed both hands on the rail, and spoke without notes. "Justice is not vengeance," he said. "It is light. It does not burn. It reveals." And what we've seen here today is not just corruption. It's fear disguised as realism. It's surrender dressed as diplomacy. But now that it is revealed, it no longer controls us. He stepped back. No applause, just silence again, the kind that comes when truth doesn't shock you, but sets you right. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Some held signs, others simply stood. As the verdict was read and the gavel fell, one voice rose from the back. "No more hiding." And another answered, "No more shame." The banners hung like velvet commandments, red and gold, flanked by bold Chinese calligraphy and clean serif English. 10th China-Africa Cooperation, Summit Progress, Partnership, Peace. Addis Ababa had never looked so choreographed. Fountains timed to music. Drones rehearsed for aerial shots. Delegations swept through the conference center in armored convoys and silk suits. There were orchestras at entrances, translators with earpieces in 12 languages. A media wall lit in blue and crimson welcomed cameras from 4 continents. Inside the Grand Continental Hall, 54 flags stood behind the elevated rows of seats, one for each African nation, one for China, and one chair was empty. Row 2. Seat C14. The flag of Burkina Faso folded neatly on the desk. The placard was there, President Ibrahim Traoré, printed in gold foil, untouched. At first it didn't seem unusual. Delegates run late. Flights delay. Formalities happen. But 10 minutes into the opening, murmurs began. By the time the vice chairman of the African Union rose to speak, more than a dozen journalists had turned from the podium and begun snapping photos of the empty seat. "Where are they?" one whispered in French. "Did they cancel last minute? No one's seen their plane on arrival logs," another replied. The Chinese delegation seated directly opposite the absentee row maintained composure. Shen Bao wasn't there, replaced this time by a more stoic figure from the Ministry of State Assets. But behind the still faces, a quiet tension pulsed. A subtle twitch here, a glance there. Someone made a call that didn't connect. Burkina Faso had not announced its withdrawal. No statement, no boycott, not even a delay. They had simply not come. And somehow that said more than any press release ever could. Because Traoré understood one thing: power is not always presence. Sometimes it is absence. When a chair meant to represent your voice remains unoccupied in front of 30 cameras and 500 diplomats, it speaks louder than applause. Whispers swirled among the rows of dignitaries. Is this protest or something bigger? Do they plan to address the UN instead? Has he cut ties with China altogether? Are others going to follow? The opening speeches tried to push through. The Minister of Infrastructure from Kenya spoke of trade corridors. The Vice President of Mozambique announced a smart port initiative, but the energy was scattered. Cameras kept panning back to the empty seat. And for the first time in the summit's history, the official live stream feed had a comment section that wasn't celebratory. It was full of questions, most repeated over and over in multiple languages. Why is Traoré not here? Outside the venue, a Chinese journalist accidentally left her mic on between segments and was caught whispering to her producer, "We built this to showcase unity," and he stole the spotlight by not showing up. By midday, speculation became a headline. The silent statement, Burkina Faso's no-show sparks, diplomatic shockwave. Al Jazeera, one empty seat, one bold message. The Guardian. Africa and Ouagadougou, the streets were calm. No parades, no broadcasts, just work and whispers and a quiet sense of purpose. Because inside every citizen who had followed #page 168, who had seen the tribunals, who had swept the ash from burned clinics, there was no need for a speech. Their absence had said it all. And in Addis Ababa, beneath the chandeliers, the golden logo, the scripted applause, no one could stop looking at the chair that waited for a man who had chosen with intention not to sit. While global attention lingered on the empty chair in Addis Ababa, something else was happening 2,900 kilometers west, in a sunlit auditorium in Ouagadougou. There were no marble pillars, no crystal chandeliers, no diplomatic red carpets, just folding chairs, reused name tags, plastic water bottles, and chalkboards covered in hand-drawn diagrams and scribbled equations. Burkina Faso was hosting its own summit. It wasn't announced with grandeur. No embassies were invited. No fanfare made it to international headlines. But by the end of the week, it would be remembered as the only summit that truly mattered. They called it simply the Moaga Forum. No flags, no anthems, just people. In attendance, solar engineers from Ghana and Ethiopia, agro-cooperative leaders from Mali, university students from Kigali, open-source tech developers from Argentina and Chile, a teacher from Bolivia who brought her entire lesson plan on energy democracy, a small delegation from Kerala, India, carrying case studies of community-owned hydrogrids. And at the center of it all, farmers from Burkina Faso, women in brightly dyed dresses, men with sun-creased faces and calloused hands sitting next to programmers and data analysts, their notepads filled with terms like microloan bypass protocols and soil sovereignty metrics. Instead of keynote speeches, there were workshops. Instead of guarded contracts, there were whiteboards filled with open blueprints. Aminata led a session titled, "Reading Contracts Before They Read You." She walked participants through a deconstructed version of the Yongxiang mining agreement, highlighting the buried clauses, The translation traps the fine print that nearly sold their sovereignty for scaffolding. One engineer from Kenya asked, "Why share this for free?" She smiled and wrote in bold across the board, "Because power grows when passed, not hoarded." There was no security detail, no press box. People came and went as they pleased. At one point, students from a local high school wandered in, sat in the back, and quietly began taking notes. By day 2, they were at the front sketching their own designs for a wind-powered grain mill. The room buzzed with languages, Wolof, Swahili, French, Spanish, Portuguese, sometimes in translation, sometimes not. It didn't matter. People pointed, explained with gestures, drew pictures, handed over USB drives, and kept going. Someone hung a bedsheet outside as a banner. On it, in charcoal strokes, were the words, "They closed the summit halls." So we opened our own. That night, as the sun dipped low and the power flickered again, no one left. They lit candles, plugged in portable solar kits. Some brought projectors powered by bike dynamos. A group of Venezuelan students screened a documentary about decentralized water systems in the Andes. It ended with a quote in Spanish, "El pueblo que construye no se rinde." The people who build do not surrender, and neither did they. TRAORÉ didn't attend the summit, not in person, but on the final day, a letter was read on his behalf. It was handwritten, short, no title, no signature. "We do not wait for permission to rise. We rise and the world adjusts. What you are building here is not a conference. It is a future." The room was quiet, and then someone clapped. Then another. Then the whole hall rose, not in applause, but in purpose. They didn't come for photos. They came to build. At first it was a ripple, a polite request, a line item buried in the agenda of routine cabinet meetings. But within weeks of the Moaga Forum, that ripple became a current. In Kinshasa, the Democratic Republic of Congo's mining ministry paused 2 pending contracts with a European rare earth consortium. Officials requested a full linguistic and jurisdictional audit of all clauses beyond page 150. In Windhoek, Namibia's parliament erupted in debate after an independent MP stood and held up a contract signed 2 years earlier with a major Chinese infrastructure firm. "Before we renew," she said, "let us all turn to page 168. In Accra, Ghana's Attorney General convened an emergency legal review team explicitly citing the Burkina Clause phenomenon as a potential risk factor in 3 large-scale hydroelectric projects. Suddenly, boardrooms were no longer talking about cost margins or environmental impact first. They were asking, what's on our page 168? The term stuck. Across Africa in ministries, universities, social media, and even street rallies. The page test became both a meme and a movement. Civil society groups printed stickers with the phrase. Young activists began holding workshops, teaching villagers how to request public records. A Pan-African legal collective launched an app that scanned contracts for sovereignty-eroding language. And yes, it defaulted to analyzing page 168. Journalists ran exposés titled Page 168, The Clauses They Never Meant You to Read. One West African columnist wrote, "We used to measure growth in GDP. Now we measure it in dignity." In Ethiopia, a senior official at the African Union off-record admitted, "It used to be about deals. Now it's about position, standing up." TRAORÉ didn't just reject a contract, he redrew the perimeter of respect. Meanwhile, the language of development began to shift. What was once aid or partnership now had to pass. The page test, a shorthand for transparency, sovereignty, and shared value. And in diplomatic circles, a new phrase emerged, dignity as currency. It wasn't spoken with irony. It was whispered with hope. Because for the first time in decades, dignity wasn't being sacrificed for deals, it was driving them. And it all began with one man pausing at one page and saying, "Not this time." It rose slowly, not like a monument, but like something being remembered. At the northern edge of Ouagadougou's industrial quarter, surrounded by red dust and mango trees, a strange new shape was taking form. Not foreign-owned, not fenced off with razor wire, not guarded by foreign soldiers in contractor uniforms. Just scaffolding, steel, solar panels, sweat, and Burkinabe hands. The site was the future home of Burkina Faso's first rare earth processing refinery and the first in West Africa to be co-designed and co-governed by nations from the global south. Not a foreign megaproject, not charity, a joint venture between equals. Engineers from Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina had arrived 2 months earlier not with suits and contracts, but with boots and toolkits. They brought schematics for modular refining systems developed in the Andes. Instead of demanding mineral rights, they offered shared learning. Instead of profit-first models, they discussed rotational governance. No CEO, no golden shovels for cameras, just welders, coders, farmers, students. Aminata had returned to her former university to recruit local apprentices. TRAORÉ approved funding not through foreign banks, but a pooled public trust raised from the very cooperatives born in the grain crisis months earlier. By the third week of construction, over 400 locals had joined the effort. There were no imported contractors, no unmarked helicopters, no black SUVs with tinted windows, only names worn on tags and painted in chalk on the concrete walls. Fatumata, brickwork; Zita, power grid; Luis, Bolivia, pressure controls; Isada, welding; Emmanuel, logistics; Bobo, South. The refinery didn't just rise, it grew from the people. One afternoon, a group of children arrived at the site. They came in a creaky yellow school van with hand-drawn signs taped to the windows. Their teacher, a wiry man with a scarf made of Fasodan Fani, explained they were from a small school in Kaya and had heard about the factory with no fence. The workers paused when they arrived, sunburned, dusty, smiling. The children stared at the rising towers, the pipes, the humming solar converter spinning in the breeze. One boy raised his hand shyly and asked, "Who owns this?" A welder face smeared with grease turned and answered without hesitation, "You do." The boy blinked. "Me, yes. You and your classmates. Your mothers. Your cousins. Your goats, too," maybe the man chuckled. "This place, it's yours before it's ours. That's the only way it works." One of the Argentinian engineers crouched next to the kids and pulled out a folded blueprint. She pointed at a circle and said in Spanish, "This is the water recapture system. We designed it based on your rainfall patterns." A girl leaned over and said, "My grandmother has a method like that for storing water in clay pots." The woman grinned. "Then she's 10 years ahead of us." Laughter rippled. They weren't there to be impressed. They were there to be included. By the time the sun dipped below the metal skeleton of the plant, the children had chalk in their hands and were allowed to write messages on the curing cement walls. One wrote, "Don't sell this." Another wrote, "This is not just steel. This is strength." And one girl, no older than 10, wrote simply, "This is the first." Because that's what it was. The first refinery. The first plant not signed behind closed doors but planned in open-air forms. Not protected by guns but by trust. Not promised to banks but to children. And for the first time in living memory, industry in Africa didn't sound like extraction. It sounded like home. The refinery was not yet operational. The pipes had been laid, the turbines calibrated, the cooling towers half-welded. Spirits were high, until the screens went black. One morning, the project's internal comm system failed. At first, it looked like a power hiccup, but then the backup server wouldn't boot. Diagnostic screens flashed gibberish. Files disappeared. Others were overwritten with strings of encrypted code. Aminata was called in. She brought a small team from the university's cybersecurity club, students, barely out of their teens but sharper than any imported consultants. Within hours, they traced the breach to a backdoor buried in old French telecom firmware, long embedded in legacy infrastructure. That night, another alert, this time from the logistics team. A convoy transporting critical pressure valves from Bobo Dioulasso arrived with half the crates torn open. Gaskets missing, internal wiring cut. No one saw who did it, but tire tracks showed someone had intercepted the shipment on a rural detour and vanished before dawn. A week later, it was a drone jam. Then a false GPS signal that rerouted a solar shipment for over 300 kilometers before they realized the path was forged. Every strike was calculated, quiet, invisible on the surface, but not without effect. Delays began to mount. Work slowed. Tensions grew. Journalists speculated, is the refinery too exposed? Is this the cost of independence? Was TRAORÉ too bold? But what no one expected was what happened next. The people stepped in, again. In the eastern region where silos had once burned, farmers now took turns guarding storage points and rotating patrols. At night, they used whistles and battery-powered radios to signal shifts. If something went missing, a replacement was organized within hours. In the suburbs of Kodugu, women's cooperatives rebuilt fiber relay lines by hand, learning from scrap, teaching each other how to solder, how to test continuity, how to climb poles. What they couldn't fix, they rerouted. Children, some barely 10, formed water teams in villages where pumps had been tampered with. They carried jerry cans, made human chains from wells to kitchens, to clinics to schools. Laughing, singing, falling, getting back up. Aminata stood one afternoon watching them pass in a line, sweat glistening, arms locked for balance. A journalist beside her whispered, "This is unsustainable." She turned, smiled, and said, "No, this is unshakable." Inside the presidential war room, TRAORÉ examined the map of ongoing incidents. Every red dot represented sabotage. But beside each one, Aminata had drawn a small blue star: citizen, responses, repairs, defenses, reroutes, crowdsourced fixes. The blue was spreading faster than the red. Every time they strike, she said, we learn. They weaken trust. We deepen it. He nodded. They control systems, but we control each other. It wasn't just a phrase, it was a truth. No wall of fire, no border of guns. Just a people too connected to divide, too informed to manipulate, and too resilient to collapse. The refinery's opening was delayed by a month, but when it opened, it ran. Not because the systems were invulnerable, but because the people behind them were. The refinery pulsed quietly now, like a heart steady humming alive. Steam curled into the dry air. Turbines whispered behind thick glass. Solar panels blinked like eyes catching sun. The structure no longer looked like scaffolding or ambition. It looked like it belonged. Not imposed, not borrowed. Built. Inside the central hallway, where technicians passed between labs and control rooms, where welders exchanged greetings with engineers and mechanics wiped sweat with their sleeves, one wall stood untouched by machinery. It was made of rough concrete, uneven, sun-warmed, and entirely covered by a mural. Drawn in layers of burnt orange soil, red and deep black, it showed a pair of bare feet stepping forward across fractured chains. In the distance, hills sprouted turbines and mango trees intertwined with copper cables. A woman's hand held a contract torn in half. A child pointed toward a rising sun, and scrawled across the middle in bold brushstrokes and dusted fingerprints, "No foreign soil under our feet. No foreign chains on our wrists." That morning, a small school group toured the refinery, the same school from Kai that had once visited during construction. The same yellow bus, the same teacher with the faded scarf. The children were older now, taller, sharper. One boy lagged behind the others as they followed a guide into the turbine hall. He stopped in front of the mural, silent. He didn't speak at first, just stared, eyes moving across the feet. The chains, the paper, the pointing child. His face was serious in a way no child's face should have to be. But it wasn't sadness. It was something else. The same welder who had greeted them years ago noticed him from across the corridor. Older now, more worn, but smiling the same. He walked over, wiping his hands. "You remember this place?" he asked gently. The boy nodded slowly. Then he pointed at the wall. "Did you paint that?" The welder shook his head. "No. That was someone from the night shift. No one signed it." The boy hesitated, then asked again, just as he had once before, "Is this really ours?" The man looked at him for a long moment, then kneeled so their eyes met. "Yes," he said, "it is, and now it always will be." The boy didn't say anything. He just stared at the mural one more time, then raised his hand and touched the wall. There was no parade, no fireworks, no grand farewell tour, just a press release from the presidential office written in 3 languages sent out at sunrise. President Ibrahim Traoré would not seek a second term. The announcement stunned many. Approval ratings were at an all-time high. Offers had poured in from media firms, think tanks, even global banks, urging him to stay on or at least transition to advisory leadership. A foundation bearing his name was drafted on his behalf. Publishers competed for the rights to a memoir he never agreed to write. He declined them all. Instead, he packed 2 small suitcases, handed over executive duties to the interim council, and requested no ceremony. "The future doesn't need a send-off," he told Aminata. "It needs space." On his second day of private life, he visited a modest building on the edge of Ouagadougou, the Sovereignty Hall, once an abandoned colonial library, now transformed into a public museum by students and volunteers. Inside were the artifacts of the movement, a broken solar panel from the blackout days, pages from the original refinery blueprints stained with welding grease, Aminata's early red lines on the Yongxiang contract now laminated behind glass, a drone's wing twisted and burned from a failed interference attempt, and in the center of the hall, a replica of the now famous page 168. He walked quietly, alone, no press, no security, just a few caretakers who recognized him and silently nodded. He paused in front of a blank display case near the exit. A small gold plaque read, "Reserved for what cannot be bought." From his coat, he pulled out a folded sheet of paper, handwritten, creased. He placed it gently inside the glass, then left. Later that evening, the case was sealed. No title was added, but by morning it had a name, not officially, but by whisper. The last note. A month after TRAORÉ stepped down, Mali announced the formation of its first inter-village resource cooperative, modeled after the Burkinabe Food Network. Benin followed with a solar microgrid initiative led entirely by women. In Niger, students crowdfunded the first open-source contract translator in 3 languages. In Congo, a mining deal signed in 2009 resurfaced. Buried on page 143 was a clause that handed 27% of mineral revenues to a holding firm based in the Caymans. No one had read it, not fully, until a group of law students compared it to their own copy of Burkina Faso's refinery contract archived online. The clause exploded into public debate. Protesters rallied outside Parliament, not with chants, but with paper. Photocopies of page 143, circle after circle, drawn in red ink. A week later, the president of Congo made a call. It was early morning. TRAORÉ answered from a modest wooden desk near a mango tree in his family's garden. "We found our own page," the Congolese president said. "Page 143. It's worse than we thought." TRAORÉ said nothing for a moment, then replied with quiet certainty, "You control the pen now." It became a line repeated across radio shows, town hall meetings, textbooks, and eventually printed on the inside cover of every constitutional law course book in Burkina Faso. "You control the pen now." Across campuses, a new tradition was born. Each year, graduating high school students wrote letters titled, "My Page 168. Some wrote about resource justice. Others wrote about honesty and leadership. One child simply wrote, "My Page 168 is the day I say no without fear." The letters were not graded. They were posted on classroom walls. One teacher explained, "We don't evaluate courage, we honor it." Meanwhile, neighboring governments began requesting access to Burkina's sovereign contract repository, an online archive of all reviewed, rejected, and rewritten deals, not for signature, but for study. Something strange began to happen. For the first time in decades, honesty became contagious. Not perfection, not utopia, just accountability. And slowly, a ripple that began with one man's pause at page 168 began to rewrite the way an entire continent negotiated its future. The Sovereignty Hall grew over time, not in size, but in weight. Visitors arrived from across the continent. Teachers, lawyers, diplomats, welders. Some came to see the redacted contracts, others to sit quietly near the mural, but most came to see the display case. The note remained untouched, not laminated, not reprinted, just preserved. Inside, in steady slanted handwriting, were the words, "I did not reject China. I rejected chains with ink on them." Our minerals are valuable, but our dignity is priceless. Children now recited it in schools like a prayer. Not out of ritual, but remembrance. A reminder that it wasn't the ink that bound them, it was the choice to sign. Aminata, now the chair of the Sovereign Research Institute, often gave walking tours to visiting students. She never pointed at the case. She simply slowed as they passed, and always one child would stop. One day, as a student stared through the glass, she asked, "Is it really true that he walked away from all that power?" Aminata smiled. He never saw it as walking away. He saw it as giving it back. Outside the hall, the refinery still hummed in the distance. The turbines turned. The workers moved with quiet confidence. You could hear the rhythm of bolts being tightened, radios buzzing with instructions, laughter from break tents. And far off behind it all, a new construction site was beginning. Another plant, a wind-powered forge, same soil, same blueprint, new hands. Then came the final voiceover, the kind that echoes not from podiums, but from truth quietly earned. Some revolutions are not fought with rifles. They're won by reading every page. What makes a revolution truly lasting? Is it the marches in the streets, the toppling of regimes, or perhaps something quieter, something that begins with a pause, a question a single word refused? In the story of Ibrahim Traoré, in page 168, we witness a revolution unlike any other. Not one of blood or banners, but of conscience. A leader who chose not to be celebrated, but to be accountable. A people who chose not to be rescued, but to rebuild. And most powerfully, a movement that was not sparked by a microphone or a missile, but by a pen hesitating over a signature. What resonates most deeply isn't the scale of the geopolitical tensions or the drama of sabotage and diplomacy. It's the clarity of intention. Traoré did not simply stop a deal. He stopped a mindset, a legacy of silence in the face of exploitation. He reminded us that sovereignty is not a flag or anthem, but a choice made again and again, even when no one is watching. This story also shows us that dignity is not something leaders hand down. It is something people claim day by day, line by line. In the farms, they defend the contracts, they question the silos they guard, and the walls they paint with their names and prayers. One of the most striking moments is not political at all. It's a young boy staring at a mural asking, "Is this really ours?" That question alone contains generations of hesitation, inherited doubt, and a hunger for belonging. The answer he receives, yes, and now it always will be, isn't just comforting, it's transformational. Because the truth is the power was never in the deal, it was always in the pen. And when you control the pen, you don't just sign contracts, you sign futures, you sign values into being. You draw the lines that define not what others think you deserve, but what you decide you will never again give away. That's why this story lingers. Not just because it's powerful, but because it's possible. Burkina Faso may be the setting, but the struggle, the choices, the courage to pause and read your own page, 168, that belongs to all of us. So I'll leave you with this. If one page could change the course of your country, your family, your life, would you read it? Or more importantly, would you hold the pen? If this story touched, you don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.